Good afternoon, and welcome for the Bureau of Business Research webinar on what's going on with Nebraska industries, officially entitled What's Hot and What's Not, Business Expectations in Nebraska's Industries. This webinar is being presented by the Bureau of Business Research, which is part of the College of Business at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My name is Eric Thompson. I'm the director of the Bureau, and I'll be leading you through our PowerPoint presentation today. Before I do that, I want to let you know about a few of the features of the webinar that you can utilize as a participant. First of all, at the bottom of your screen is a bar where you have several options and features that you can choose. For example, there's a chat window where you can chat with some of the other participants in the webinar. There's also, you can push a button for the question and answer window. At any point during this webinar presentation, you can type in a question, or you can wait to the end and type in a question. And at the end of the webinar, at the end of the PowerPoint, I'll go ahead and answer your questions at that time. The last feature to note is we have 2 poll questions that we're going to ask of webinar participants during the webinar. I'll announce those when they come up and invite you to go ahead and give your opinion. And then later on in the webinar, we'll present some information to answer the poll question. So I hope you'll look forward to participating in those. With those points made, I'm going to go ahead and begin our PowerPoint presentation, What's Hot, What's Not, Business Expectations in Nebraska's Industries. Just to give you a little idea of the outline of material, we're going to talk about the Survey of Nebraska Business, which is our data source where we're getting this information about consumer confidence, business confidence in these various industries. We're going to look at business confidence by industry. And then for the most and least confident industries, the ones that kind of separated themselves from the others, we're going to look at the key issues those industries face and try to develop some insights about why some industries are doing so well, where others are struggling a little bit more. So let's start by talking about the Survey of Nebraska Business. This is a monthly survey that the Bureau of Business Research conducts. We get over 100 responses every month. However, in this webinar, we wanted to present information by detailed industry. There's over 15 industry groupings, so obviously 100 survey responses isn't going to be enough to have industry-specific data. So what we've done is we've combined surveys from the last 6 months, September 2018 through February 2019. We don't have our March 2019 data ready quite yet, as the month is not over. So over that recent 6-month period, we combined all of the data, giving us a large enough sample size to have detailed information about 10 specific industries, which we'll be presenting a little bit later. We were able to get a sufficient sample size, which we defined as at least 30 completed surveys for these multiple key industries. A little bit more about the Survey of Nebraska Business. Again, it's a monthly survey where it asks businesses about their plans for growth, their recent growth, and their top business issue. The survey is sent to a random sample each month of 500 Nebraska businesses. We survey businesses of all sizes, and we survey businesses in all industries, including agriculture. So our survey tends to be a good sample of businesses of all sizes, well represented by smaller businesses, as well as some responses from the state's large business. And I think it's a somewhat unique data source in that sense. The response rate varies between 20% and 35% on a monthly basis, typically within the range of 25 to 30% or 125 to 150 completed surveys. The survey has been this monthly survey has been conducted continuously from January 2012 through, we're in the middle of our March 2019 survey right now. What kind of questions are on the survey? We endeavor to make it a short survey. All the 6 questions fit on one side of one sheet of paper. And that's, I think, part of the reason we have a good response rate for a mail survey, as I showed you on the last slide. That and the fact that the survey is sent out in a letter from the University of Nebraska, I think that helps our response rate quite a bit as well. Anyway, what do we ask? here's one example of a question, and I think if you see this question written out, it'll help you understand the other three pertinent questions as well. So one question we ask is, during the next 6 months, do you expect that the dollar sales volume at your business will be higher, lower, or about the same as it was over the last 6 months? And we just give people three simple answers: higher, lower, or about the same. So if it's up very slightly and someone feels about the same is a better answer than higher, then that's what they'll go ahead and choose. So we get answers in these three categories. In particular, we have a certain percentage of businesses that'll say higher or lower rather than about the same. We ask a similar question about growth over the last 6 months. So we say, what's your recent growth been? Where are you now compared to where you were 6 months ago? So again, higher, lower, or about the same. Then we say we have a similar pair of two questions about employment. Has employment grown recently? And the last question is, do you expect employment to grow between now and 6 months from now? So we wind up with four responses: higher or lower, or about the same, in terms of sales and employment 6 months from now, or recent growth in sales and employment. For each of these four questions, we calculate something called a diffusion index. Basically, if an equal number of respondents say that they expect sales or employment to be higher or lower, the diffusion index will have a value of 100. If a higher share say sales will be higher than say sales will be lower, then the diffusion index will have a value over 100. And if there's a big gap, you can get quite large values like 110, even up to 120, 130, when you just have a much higher percentage of businesses saying sales will rise than sales will fall. It works in the same way for employment. So we calculate a diffusion index for all four questions, and then we combine them into a single diffusion index value and say that consumer confidence is positive in Nebraska if the diffusion index is over 100, especially if it's comfortably over 100. And we would say that business confidence index for Nebraska is negative if the diffusion index is less than 100. So if you look at the last 6 months of surveying, September through 2018 through February of 2019, we've had quite a positive value for the diffusion index, 110.2 on average. So the business confidence index for Nebraska averaged 110.2. This obviously denotes a fairly high level of business confidence in our state's economy that's benefited our economic growth over the last 6 months, or reflected it. Okay, before I go on in the survey and talk about some of the industry by industry results for business confidence, we want to ask that first poll question. So of the three sectors you see here, which sector do you believe had the weakest confidence over the last 6 months of surveying? September 2018 through February 2019. Finance and insurance, manufacturing, or retail trade. So go ahead and think about that for a minute and put in your response, and we'll see some information about that a little later in the webinar, get an answer to this first poll question. One more thing I needed to tell you about the survey before we proceed to the results. We also have one open-ended question, not a diffusion index, but we simply invite respondents to give their opinion, and then we categorize those open-ended responses into 13 categories. And that question is, what is the most important issue facing your business today? So not everything that's important, but what is that one most important issue? We take open-ended answers and we categorize that into 13 categories. Here's the categories that we put the answers into, and they're kind of based on economic and business concepts, these categories. So customer demand. So if an agricultural producer is talking about commodity prices, that's an issue of customer demand. What's the price level from customers? If a business is talking about demands changing because our town's population is rising fast or it's falling, that's an example of customer demand. If a business says that they're worried about the economy And that's a worry about whether the customers will be there or there'll be a lower level customer demand if they think a recession is coming. So all those types of open-ended answers fall into customer demand. People complain about the price of gas or their rent at their business location, or what utilities are costing. Those, what it costs to have to buy things that they sell or use to manufacture. Those are all the costs of goods and services. So those sorts of open-ended answers would fall in that category. People talk about how it's hard to find workers or easy to find workers. Typically, I hear more comments about how it's hard to find workers. That falls into labor availability and quality, and on and on. Taxes, healthcare costs, the Affordable Care Act, general business regulation outside of healthcare, whether retirement and business transition is an issue, whether competition with other businesses is a big problem. We hear a lot about that in certain sectors, from online competition, or sometimes businesses in smaller towns are worried about competition from nearby cities. Obviously, weather and drought can play a factor, or other types of weather concerns like we've had recently is another type of answer that we get. So those are the categories those open-ended answers are organized into, and we'll present some information about that later in the webinar as well. Okay, so now we're ready to look at results. We had about 30 surveys from agricultural businesses, 60 from construction, 30 from manufacturing. Of course, those tend to be larger businesses. 100 from retail trade, and you see the list there of businesses where we have enough responses to comment on that individual industry. So what is hot? What are the sectors where the Business Confidence Index Nebraska, the BCIN, is really strong, well above 100? Well, there's two that are, you remember that average across all industries was 110.2. Well, look at finance and insurance and manufacturing, right around or above 125. So the respondents from these industries were much, much more likely to say that sales and employment have been growing or they're expected to grow than saying that sales and employment were expected to decline. So very positive business confidence in these two industries. So finance obviously is a key part of the economy. Good to see optimism there. And manufacturing is a sector that's, over the last few decades has had periods where it's really struggled. So it's nice to see so much confidence in the manufacturing sector as well. And we have had a stronger manufacturing sector over the last 6 months and really the last few years. So those are the industries that are hot. What is not? So what are the sectors where the business confidence is a little weaker? Now remember, anything over 100 is positive business confidence. So we don't really have a lot of individual industries where we literally have negative confidence. But we do have in construction and retail trade two industries where business confidence is barely positive. It's really quite close to even. So about as many construction businesses would say they're expecting sales and employment to decline as would say they're expecting it to increase. Similarly with retail trade. And then agriculture is the one sector which is actually experiencing negative business confidence. Now these surveys were all taken before the recent flooding, so that doesn't reflect flooding necessarily, but it does reflect poor commodity prices and other factors that have been affecting agriculture in recent years. Now, by the way, a little later in the webinar, we are going to present some detailed information about why confidence might be lower, or what sort of challenges are businesses in each of these 5 industries facing, whether it's these 3 industries that are struggling or the 2 industries I showed you on the last slide where business confidence was so high. Well, at this point, I believe we've received enough information to answer the first poll question. As you recall, that question was, which sector had the weakest confidence? And as it turned out, it was retail trade. Finance, insurance, manufacturing had very high confidence, but retail trade had the lowest confidence. So it looks like about half of you had that. Nobody thought it would be finance and insurance, but based on past history, I think it was reasonable to assume that perhaps the manufacturing sector would have some concerns. But over the last 6 months, the manufacturing sector actually has been quite confident. It's retail trade where confidence is a bit lower. Of course, that could be related to internet competition and some other factors. We'll get more into that a little bit later. So, by the way, since we've answered the first poll question, let's go ahead and ask the second poll question. And we only have 2 this month, so this will be our last poll question. If you look at the government regulation, remember that was one of our 13 categories that we put the open-ended answers into. Is government regulation a leading concern among the most confident industries like manufacturing and finance, or the least confidence industries like agriculture, retail, trade, or construction? So take a moment and think about your answer there, and I'll go ahead and reveal some information on that a little later in the webinar. Okay, well, we left out one group of industries, the ones that are more average. So they weren't especially strong, or they weren't on the weaker side. Their level of business confidence, according to their own industry diffusion index, was pretty close to the all industry average of 110.2. So what do we have in this list? We have the healthcare sector, maybe a little more confident than the average industry, but pretty close. Wholesale trade doesn't have the concern level that retail trade did. Accommodation and food services, that's mostly restaurants, that's right about the average. Consumer demand's been pretty good lately. And professional, scientific, and technical services, very important industry that has a lot of high-wage job growth. That is fully participating in the business confidence that we see in Nebraska industries overall. Okay, but the average ones may be a little less interesting. I want to focus through the rest of the webinar on those 5 industries that had very strong, especially strong confidence, or a little bit weaker confidence. So let's talk about each of these. And what we're going to do is I'll remind you of the Business Confidence Index Nebraska value for each of those 5 industries. And then I'll also give you the responses to that open-ended poll question. What is the most important issue facing your business? We've got the answers for finance businesses, for manufacturers, for construction businesses, and so forth. So let's proceed with that. Finance and insurance. That had a Business Confidence Index Nebraska diffusion index value of 126.4. So far more businesses saying sales and employment are likely to expand as saying it might contract. So what are the top issues for these businesses? Well, customer demand, that's often a very big issue. You got to have customers, you got to grow customer demand for the business to thrive. So you would expect to see that up there. About a third of businesses, that's about the average you get across all industries. Now, finance and insurance is interesting in the sense that a large share of those businesses say that government regulation is their top concern. For industries overall, this number might come in 6, 7, 8% in a typical month. But over this 6-month period, nearly 1 in 5 finance and insurance businesses listed that as a top concern. So we know there's always been a lot of regulation on the finance industry. Some more of that was introduced over the last decade. Seems to be a big area of concern. Labor availability and quality, that's the third one at 13%. That's not a small number, but it is smaller than you see in a lot of industries. And that may reflect that finance and insurance pays pretty well. And the extent that we have a workforce available in Nebraska, they're able to attract the needed share of workers to their industry. Let's look at manufacturing. Very interesting results here. And manufacturing is quite different than the typical industry, which might be expected. It's a very different industry in a lot of ways. Labor availability and quality, remember what that was for finance, 13%? It's 3 times as large, nearly 35% for manufacturing. For industries overall, this might be 20, 25% of businesses choosing labor availability and quality. So we can see it's a key issue for manufacturing. So you've probably heard about the manufacturing skills gap. Our survey certainly is consistent with that idea. Businesses are having trouble finding welders, machinery, mechanics, other key skilled manufacturing workers. Government regulation, once again, is a big issue. 15%, well above the all industry average, which would be 6 to 8%. Cost of goods and services. Obviously, manufacturers usually have to buy a lot of parts to process further at their manufacturing plant and assemble. And the cost of goods and services appears to be a growing concern. Less concern about customer demand. That's quite a low number for customer demand. Again, reflecting that's a pretty strong manufacturing sector right now, if businesses can get the labor that they need to expand. Okay, let's look at some of the sectors that have been struggling a little bit more. So agriculture, the one sector where business confidence was actually very slightly negative, but negative. Customer demand is a huge issue there, much higher than normal. And again, that's those low commodity prices. It's really a big issue, obviously, for agriculture, and it's on the top of people's minds. But there are other issues. There's actually some concerns with labor availability as well in agriculture, getting the workers that are needed for farm and ranch production. And of course, taxes are a very large concern. For industries overall, taxes might register as the top issue for 5, 6, perhaps 7% of responding businesses. In agriculture, it's 2 to 3 times as high. And we know that Nebraska's farmers and ranchers are quite concerned about property taxes, and that's certainly reflected in our survey. Government regulation, really not that big an issue. It is a big issue, but it doesn't register as the top issue for the farmers and ranchers responding to our survey. So we're now able to look at the second set of poll results. For which type of industry is government regulation a leading concern? It turns out it's the most confident industries. Good job for the webinar participants. You got that right. About 2/3 of you chose that option. And so regulation for industries that are expanding, where things are really positive at the moment, it could be that regulation, like labor availability, is a factor that's holding back that growth more than it's affecting industries that are struggling. Those industries tend to have other issues. But if we want our fast-growing industries to continue to succeed, or succeed even faster, succeed even more, regulation may be something we need to look at. Okay, back to some of those industries that are closer to neutral in terms of business confidence, close to that value of 100. Let's look at construction. Once again, we see labor availability and quality is a huge issue, just like it was for manufacturing. Skilled blue-collar workers is an area where the skills gap is very significant. We certainly see that result here with almost 2 out of 5, almost 40% of respondents from the construction industry indicating that labor availability and quality is their top concern. It's not so much customer demand, and it's not so much regulation. Those are issues, but not the top issue in this sector compared to labor availability. Let's look at the last one, retail trade. Customer demand is an issue there, but overall customer demand has been pretty good lately for the retail sector. The bigger issue, of course, is competition. Again, for industries overall, competition might be the top issue. Competition from other businesses might be the top issue for 1 in 10 businesses. For retail trade, it's between 20 and 25%. 22% of businesses listed that as their top issue. So that's just a very competitive industry that's related to the internet. Before it was related to the internet, it was related to big box stores. Retailers continue to be under tremendous pressure in our modern economy. Labor available quality is also an issue that's pretty prominent for this sector. Okay, well, those are the main points we wanted to make, telling you which industries are doing quite well right now, which are struggling, and a little bit into the why for those industries that are either quite strong or on the weak side. So now would be a great time to answer any questions that have come up during the PowerPoint presentation. Are there any questions? Seeing none, I'm going to make a few other points here, and you still have a minute to ask a question. I want to invite each of you to attend and sign up for our next webinar, which will be on, this is actually a study we've done for several years, so a follow-up study on the economic impact of Nebraska military assets and spending, which will be presented by Mitch Harrian and Philip O'Donnell. And that'll be on April 19th, so you can actually go today and sign up for that one, talking about the important role that military assets play in Nebraska's economy. I'd also like to remind you that you can stay connected with the BBR, follow us on social media with the following locations on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. You can also subscribe to our e-newsletter. We send out our monthly reports on the economy and special reports from time to time, and announcements for all our webinars and so forth. Just send your preferred email address to bbr@unl.edu and we'll add you to our email list. Well, thank you so much for, we do have one question. So before we sign off, let's answer these questions. What was the basis of the industry answers to the survey questions? In other words, why did those answers seem to vary so much by industry? I think it's because the economy is in flux. So if we had a very stable economy, we might expect industries and various businesses to have fairly common answers. But because the industry is the economy is changing so much with international competition, with technology, with automation, we can have periods where workers need to change their skills quickly to adapt, where businesses need to adapt to new competitors, to adapt to new competitive realities. And some industries can be affected differently than others. And so you see retail focused on its competitors, often online competitors or bigger stores in larger communities. You can see manufacturing with the change in the skills needed in that industry, very focused on labor availability, a similar issue for construction. And you have your expanding industries worried about regulation holding it back. So I think it's the fact that our economy is changing so much right now that we get very different answers from different industries. Well, thank you again for joining us. Feel free to email and follow up if any follow-up questions occur to you. And please participate in our next webinar upcoming on April 19th.